Hi, my name is Vikas. I'm the Chief Executive of Swisscot Group. We are a textiles and commodities trading business here in Manchester.
I mean, Vikas, I texted you yesterday to talk about Brexit, but obviously if we just start with this ongoing situation in Dover that hopefully will resolve today, how has that situation been to manage with everything else that's going on in terms of Brexit preparations?
So the challenge for most trading businesses has been the fact that, I think we've all seen these adverts talking about prepare yourselves for Brexit. But the challenge is that no one's really identified what those preparations need to be. So as we sit here today, because we're unaware of whether or not there will or will not be a deal, we don't even know, what tariffs might be in place on January the 1st, for example. The necessity to therefore stockpile has meant that most UK ports were already well over capacity, were already experiencing significant freight delays. There was tens of thousands of containers at port. One of the knock-on effects of that has been that in supply countries around the world, there's not even enough shipping containers to then ship goods here. People have been trying to unload goods at the nearest European port, but then there's no freight capacity to get the goods into the UK because of the new delays at Dover. So in my entire time in business, in terms of, just sheer challenges around logistics, I don't think we've had a time like this.
Which is quite worrying to hear, given the time of year, and we know sort of the people trying to get things into the country and out of the country with Christmas trade as well, I guess. How important is it that France and the UK, and I guess the EU, are able to resolve this situation in these crisis talks today? We know it was only a temporary ban, but I'm guessing there's now going to be a huge backlog to clear up.
If they do one thing today, they need to resolve this freight blockage. Because there are currently, thousands perhaps of trucks that are backlogged if we factor in both sides of the channel. These are critical supply chains. We all know about the supply chains for food, because that's probably the most critical. But these are also the supply chains that often handle other critical products, like in our case, textiles that go into end uses in medicine. Some people might say, well, why don't you just air freight the goods in? And I think that's a valid question. But when you look at air freight, the cost of the air freight of those goods is sometimes so prohibitive. And even then, air freight routes are very close to capacity as well, meaning that even finding air freight slots is difficult. So they need to get a deal agreed to smooth the port congestion and actually get things moving again.
That 2020 needed, wasn't it, really, especially in the run-up to Christmas. Just sort of then looking at Brexit, we are now just 8 days away, aren't we, from officially leaving the EU. We always were told and warned that it could be close to the wire, but did you ever anticipate that it would be this last minute, really, for businesses to find out what exactly 2021 will look like in terms of our relationship with Europe?
So I think in my mind, I had two perspectives on this. I think myself and, many of the businesses that we work with were holding out hope that there would have been clarity, that there would have been some form of deal, that there would have been some form of instruction to the business community which tangibly tells people what to do. But I think the reality is most businesses that I know, at least, including ours, had assumed that wouldn't be the case, that we would probably end up with a no deal. And that it's going to cause disruption. The biggest worry, of course, with all of this is we don't know what that disruption will look like because no information's been given, which makes it practically impossible to plan for beyond stockpiling.
And we see figures, I think, from the FSB who say fewer than 1 in 5 small businesses are prepared. And is that because it is impossible to prepare for something when we don't exactly know what to prepare for? Is that the challenge here?
Correct. So we've all seen those statistics as well, which say that, only a small amount of businesses are prepared. And the ones that are prepared tend to be the much larger multinationals who can, rehome themselves in another geography or so on. But for most businesses, the challenge is not that the businesses don't have the necessary skills or resources to prepare. But no one knows what we're preparing for, because no one knows what will be the reality of trade the day after, right? Because if we have a deal or no deal, the two are dramatically different. And you cannot obviously plan for both eventualities, especially this close to the bone. And so earlier in the year, 3, 4, 5 months ago, that would have been the time frame that businesses need to prepare, because supply chains are running over, quarters and months. They're not things that you can just switch on and off overnight. So businesses needed months to prepare the supply chains, to make them resilient, to get financing and structures in place to make this work.
I'm guessing, coronavirus, no one could have foreseen what this year would bring, but how's COVID-19 thwarted a lot of those preparations? Has it almost, I guess distraction is not the right word, but has it almost been something else that businesses have had to deal with that ultimately has meant Brexit hasn't perhaps been the priority it could have been?
So COVID has been like a global natural disaster. It's disrupted supply chains, it's disrupted businesses, it's also caused, significant financial damage to businesses that makes businesses themselves less resilient, right? And this is key with Brexit planning. One of the things that most businesses had done to give them some headroom for Brexit was to financially plan reserves and to make sure that at least you have the financial resilience to deal with something like Brexit, where the outcome is somewhat unknown. For most businesses who are in the industrial sectors, so we're talking about import, manufacturing, engineering, things like that, for most of those businesses, not all of course, those reserves have now been burnt, just getting businesses to survive the pandemic. So you've now got businesses that have really burnt through their reserves coming into a period of huge uncertainty with Brexit. And that will cause casualties, and it will cause further challenges for the industrial sector, which is one of the UK's major employers and major economic contributors.
It's just unbelievable, isn't it, that this is how the end of these 4 years would end up, I guess. You mentioned, actually, when we were talking about the situation at Dover, that, there are all these lack of containers, businesses are stockpiling. Is that the situation? And I know the Federation of Small Businesses have said that many, because of fears at the end of the transition, are stockpiling, which is causing this problem at UK ports. Is that what the situation looks like on the ground, that all these companies are stockpiling now?
So from our port intel that we get, obviously we've got very close relationships, this is exactly the case. And you've ended up with, thousands of containers of goods that have come in. Oftentimes they've come in for businesses that have then ceased to trade, which means that those containers are now held pending, the breakdown of those companies. You've also got thousands of containers of goods which are effectively being, in inverted commas, stored at port, attracting charges, but because there's no warehouse space available for those goods to go into. So, it's a really, really difficult time for port operators as well, because, the ports have wiggle room, they have buffers, but those buffers are designed for the normal ups and downs of trade and the normal disruptions that you experience. You're moving goods around the world on boats, disruptions happen, that's normal. But there's very few ports, at least in Western Europe, that have the capacity to handle disruption on this scale in a way that means that supply chains themselves are not disrupted. And that's the problem which businesses here and ultimately consumers will be feeling.
Vikas, those are the main things I wanted to ask you about. I know we've gone through a fair bit of stuff there. Is there anything else, though, that you wanted to talk about that I've not asked about at all?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is for all of us as consumers to also be aware that in general, businesses are doing their absolute best, right? So most businesses that I know are going grey, trying to make sure that goods are here in time, at the right quality, and that supply chains are maintained as robustly as possible. And so with that in mind, just, be gentle on the businesses that you work with as well, because this is a strange time for all of us, and we're all trying to just work through it together and make sure that we get the right outcomes.
Vikas, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you just adding that at the end. It's
cool.
Just good for us to bear in mind, isn't it, as consumers. If you could hit stop then